Charlotte Hayes was halfway through making her morning coffee when her phone vibrated. It was a video message from Mrs. Kessler, her childhood neighbor, a woman she hadn't seen or heard from in over 10 years. Just the name alone made her stomach twist. She opened the message, expecting maybe a nostalgic hello or a random update. But there was no greeting, no explanation, just one bone-chilling sentence. "I'm so sorry, Charlotte. I can't believe what I saw today." Her hands started trembling. She hit play. The screen showed Holy Grace Chapel, the same church her parents used to drag her to every Christmas as a child. The video zoomed in on the altar. Two familiar figures appeared. Her mother in dramatic black lace, eyes dry but pretending to sob, and her father, stiff, solemn, reading from a crumpled paper. Behind them stood a casket, and next to it, framed with flowers, was her photo. Charlotte felt her knees weaken. Then came her father's voice, low and rehearsed. She struggled with so much, but we never stopped loving her. Her obituary, her funeral. But Charlotte wasn't dead. She was standing in her apartment, very much alive. And someone had buried her, on purpose. Charlotte couldn't breathe. She sat down hard on the kitchen stool, her phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline. The funeral video kept playing in a cruel loop, her photo framed in flowers, her father's calm voice, weaving lies for a room full of mourners. And worst of all, they all believed it. She scrubbed the timeline back again. Her mother spoke next, voice wavering just enough to seem sincere. "We lost our daughter far too young, but now maybe she's finally at peace." Charlotte felt bile rise in her throat. What peace? She wasn't dead. She'd never even been in an accident. She was working as a barista in Portland, paying rent, filing taxes. She even sent her parents a Christmas card 2 years ago. No reply, of course. She'd been disowned before. But this was murder by paperwork. The more she watched, the colder it got. Her mother mentioned a tragic overseas car crash. Her father claimed she'd lived her final years in isolation and despair. But they knew where she was. They knew she was alive. They just wanted the world to think she wasn't. And it had worked. Charlotte opened her laptop, pulled up her old email, deactivated. She tried to recover it. No luck. Then came the blow that nearly knocked her off the stool. This account was reported as inactive due to user deceased. Officially, digitally, they'd killed her. On paper at least, she shook with rage. Who had that kind of power? Who would go that far? And why? That's when it hit her. Elena, her younger sister, the angel, the good one, always perfect, always adored. Charlotte had taken the fall for Elena once before, when $60,000 mysteriously vanished from their father's company. Charlotte was blamed, cut off, thrown out like garbage. No investigation, no trial, just silence. And now, Elena had erased her entirely. Charlotte's jaw clenched. She opened Elena's Instagram, something she hadn't dared look at in years. And there it was, a glittering wedding slideshow. White dress, diamond ring, champagne toasts. Every family member was smiling. Even Uncle Tony, who never left New Jersey. But not one photo mentioned Charlotte. Not even a single "wish you were here." Instead, in a caption beneath a photo of her father making a toast, it read, "To the daughter who made us proud." Her blood ran cold. The daughter who made them proud wasn't her. They hadn't just replaced her. They'd profited from her death. Charlotte didn't sleep that night. Rage throbbed under her skin, like a second heartbeat. She'd spent years trying to forget, trying to move on. But now, she couldn't look away. Not after this. She was officially dead. Her sister had stolen her identity, her inheritance, her existence, and the world had played along like it was all perfectly normal. She needed proof, more than just screenshots and outrage. She wanted irrefutable evidence. The next morning, she dug through every box under her bed. Old documents, receipts, passports, lease agreements, immigration papers. She lined them up across the floor like puzzle pieces. Every stamp, every signature, every flight. She wasn't hiding anymore. That's when the next shock hit her. She decided, on a whim, to check the National Vital Records database, the public archive that listed all deaths. And there it was, Charlotte Hayes. Status, deceased. Cause, international vehicular accident. Certificate ID, TXM0421D. The date, just 3 months after she had moved abroad. They hadn't waited long. But here's what shattered her completely. The death certificate wasn't just there. It had been verified by a licensed medical officer. And the signature at the bottom? Dr. Elaine Harper. Charlotte's jaw dropped. That was her mother's oldest friend, her godmother, the woman who used to bake her birthday cakes and whisper bedtime stories into her ear. They didn't just write her off, they conspired. Her own godmother helped fake her death. She called immediately. The line rang once, twice, voicemail. Charlotte left a message, voice trembling but fierce. I know what you did. I know the signature on the certificate. I'm alive and I'm coming back. That same afternoon, an unknown number texted her. They're holding a memorial for you this Sunday. Holy Grace, noon. No name, no context, but she didn't need one. It was real. They were doing it again. This time not just quietly, legally, publicly. She stared at the screen, pulse pounding. They were going to mourn her again, weep, lie, put on a show. Maybe Elena would cry a single tear. Maybe her father would clutch a glass of wine. Like grief tasted expensive. Charlotte closed her eyes. No, she wasn't letting this slide. Not this time. She grabbed her folder, packed it with every document she had, zipped up her black coat, and looked at her reflection in the mirror. She didn't see a victim. She saw a storm. As Charlotte stared into the mirror, something inside her cracked, and it wasn't fear. It was the final splinter of that little girl who still hoped her family might one day call, say it was all a misunderstanding, maybe even apologize. That girl was gone now. What remained was a woman forged in betrayal. Charlotte had spent years blaming herself for not being enough, for not fitting the perfect mold, for trusting the wrong people, for being the convenient scapegoat when money went missing, when Elena's lies piled too high. But now she saw the truth. She wasn't the problem. They were. Her parents didn't want a daughter. They wanted a product. Something polished, compliant, controllable. And when Charlotte stopped performing, they replaced her with someone shinier, someone obedient, someone who'd sell her soul for applause and inheritance. She had once believed love meant protection. That family was a bond nothing could sever. But the truth was uglier. Blood doesn't mean loyalty, and love with conditions isn't love at all. For years, she'd wandered the world carrying the shame they gave her, like a weight strapped to her back. But watching that funeral video changed everything. Seeing her photo next to a casket, hearing her father lie through gritted teeth, watching her mother sob like a seasoned actress, it lit a fuse inside her. She realized she wasn't the broken one. They were. They were the ones who abandoned, erased, betrayed. They were the cowards who couldn't face the truth, so they rewrote it. And now they would face the one thing they never planned for, her return. No more hiding, no more shrinking herself, no more begging for a place at a table that had already thrown her chair away. She had receipts now, not just paperwork, but pain, transformed into power. Her silence had once protected them, but silence was over. Charlotte picked up the envelope containing the death certificate, holding it up to the light. The seal shimmered. Official, cold, a lie dressed as truth. She smiled bitterly. They buried her legally, ceremonially, socially. But they forgot one thing. You can't kill someone who already knows the truth, and you can't outrun the ghost you created. They thought she would stay buried, but she wasn't a memory. She was the reckoning. The next morning, Charlotte walked into a law office, like she was walking onto a battlefield. Her boots echoed across the tile floor. She carried a thick folder, passport stamps, employment contracts, tax filings, visa records, rental agreements, every document that proved she had been alive, working, and surviving during the exact time her family claimed she was dead. The young attorney behind the desk glanced at her, then at the documents. His eyes widened. "You're challenging your own death?" Charlotte nodded, her voice razor sharp. "I'm not dead, but I plan to haunt every single one of them." The attorney blinked, then leaned forward, intrigued. This is massive. We can file a motion to revoke the death declaration immediately. Once that's in place, we move on to fraud, identity theft, possibly even embezzlement. She placed the forged death certificate in front of him. "That's not just fraud," she said coldly. "That's erasure. And it wasn't just about her. If her family could do this to her, what were they capable of doing to others? To people without resources, without proof, without the will to fight back." This was no longer personal. It was a reckoning. As the attorney began drafting the motion, Charlotte's phone buzzed again. Another anonymous message. "Memorial this Sunday, noon. Full guest list." Attached was a photo of the printed program. "In loving memory of Charlotte Hayes." In elegant script, framed with white lilies. She stared at the image. This wasn't a tribute, it was a show, and she was done letting them perform. That night, Charlotte stood in her apartment, staring out the window at the city lights flickering like a sea of broken stars. Her breath fogged the glass. They had stolen her name. Now she was going to take it back. She opened her closet and pulled out a black coat, the same one she wore the day she left home for the last time. The day her father told her she was no longer his daughter. She slipped it on, not out of nostalgia, out of armor. This wasn't about revenge, it was about truth, and Charlotte had it now. By the time Sunday came, she wasn't nervous. She was ready to walk into her own funeral and reclaim every piece of herself they tried to bury. She will be their karma. Sunday arrived like a storm. Gray skies, cold wind, a silence that hung heavy in the air like anticipation before a final act. Charlotte stood across the street from Holy Grace Chapel, hidden beneath a black coat and sunglasses. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from controlled fury. She watched as guests arrived, all dressed in black, hugging, whispering, dabbing fake tears. They were here to mourn her, to cry over a lie. She waited. At 11:58, the bells of Holy Grace began to toll. Long, hollow, dramatic. Inside, the service had started. Charlotte crossed the street, step by step, heart pounding like a war drum. When she reached the doors, she paused, listening. Her father's voice was speaking again. She was troubled, but we prayed for her every day. Liar. She gripped the door handle. May she rest in peace. Not yet. She pushed the doors open, deliberately. The twin oak doors groaned, creaking like a tomb opening. Light poured into the dark chapel. Heads turned, one by one. Eyes widened. Gasps erupted like cracks in glass. Charlotte stepped forward. Every heel strike on the marble echoed like judgment. Click, click, click. The world had thought she was gone, but now she stood beneath the arch of her own funeral, like a specter carved from truth and fire. A child's voice broke the tension. "Mom, isn't that her?" Charlotte pulled off her sunglasses. Silence fell like ash. Her mother's face turned pale, her lips parted, trembling. Then she collapsed, a dramatic faint like from a soap opera. Lace glove over her eyes. Charlotte didn't flinch. Her father's hand shook, wine glass falling, shattering against the pew. Elena's jaw clenched so tightly, it seemed like she might crack a tooth. She didn't move. Charlotte walked down the aisle, slowly, purposefully. People whispered. Phones came out. Someone started recording. Good, let them see. She reached the altar, stood in front of the very photo they used to pretend she was dead. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I heard I died, but I'm here to correct the story." A murmur rippled. There was no crash, no tragic end, no lost daughter. She pulled out the folder, slamming it on the podium. "These are my records, my life, my proof." She turned to her father. "You faked my death." Then to Elena. "And you stole my future." No one spoke. The weight of her words sank like stones in a river, and Charlotte, once the cast-off, the forgotten, the erased, stood taller than she ever had before. She wasn't just alive, she was unstoppable. Charlotte didn't cry, not when her mother fainted, not when her father's hand trembled, not even when Elena turned away. unable to meet her eyes. She had cried enough in the shadows, behind closed doors, into pillows that had heard her scream silently for years. But here, under the harsh light of truth, tears had no place. She looked around the chapel. Some people stared in shock, some in shame, and some in admiration, because even they could see it. This woman had walked into her own funeral and reclaimed her life. She didn't shout, she didn't accuse, she just stood, unshakable, unapologetic, unburied. Charlotte reached into her coat pocket and pulled out one last thing, a printed copy of the court motion, the official request to revoke her death certificate. She raised it above her head, steady and silent. "I'm alive," she said simply. "And this is just the beginning." She turned, walking back down the aisle, not like a ghost haunting the living, but like a woman who had risen from the fire they tried to burn her with. Each step echoed louder than applause. Outside, the wind hit her face like a baptism, cold, clean, clarifying. For the first time in years, Charlotte didn't feel hunted. She felt free. The doors closed behind her, but they didn't matter anymore. The people inside were stuck in a lie they built with trembling hands. But Charlotte, she was building something new, with truth, with pain, with fire. She walked straight to her lawyer's office, handed over the signed affidavit, and watched the legal machine begin to move. Fraud, identity theft, forgery, all of it under investigation. They wanted to erase her, but they forgot one thing: dead women don't come back, but survivors do. And Charlotte Hayes was a survivor. Later that night, she sat alone at a small cafe, watching the city glow around her. She didn't post a triumphant photo, didn't blast her story online. Not yet, because this wasn't about revenge. This was about reclaiming the space she was never supposed to occupy again. Her name, her story, her truth. And when the time came, she would share it. With the world, with others who'd been silenced, erased, buried under lies not of their own making. But tonight, she just let herself exist, fully, fiercely, quietly, no longer a ghost, but a wildfire in human form. Sometimes, the greatest strength is not in fighting back with fists, but in standing tall with truth. Charlotte's story reminds us that no matter how deeply others try to bury us, under lies, silence, or shame, the truth has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. We live in a world where people can rewrite narratives, erase identities, and silence voices they don't want to hear. But being forgotten does not mean being gone, and being erased does not mean defeated. She didn't return for vengeance. She returned for her own name, her own existence. And in doing so, she gave voice to countless others who were told they were too complicated, too loud, or better off invisible. The lesson is clear. Even if they write your ending for you, you have the right to tear the page and write your own. If you've ever been pushed aside, disowned, or told that your story doesn't matter, you are not alone. Charlotte's journey is a powerful reminder that your identity, your truth, and your voice are still yours, no matter how many people try to silence them. Whether through legal steps, personal healing, or simply reclaiming your narrative, you have the right to exist fully and unapologetically. Start small, gather your records, revisit your story, speak up in rooms that once made you feel invisible. The world doesn't get to decide your worth. You do. If you enjoy deep, emotional, and meaningful stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new update. Your support is the motivation that drives us to keep bringing you powerful stories. Once again, thank you for being here, and see you in the next story.